Good evening, everyone. We're glad you joined us this evening for a prayer meeting. I see one new face. I would like to welcome, I can't remember your name, but I know you play the violin. Hayden, yes. So I would like to welcome you from, I believe you're from Australia, right? So welcome here to Roanoke. We're excited to have you here. And to all of you, you're very welcome to join us also online. And so, as you know, this past year we have been going through the book of Daniel, and unfortunately we don't have the whole time to go through a lot of the details in the book of Daniel, but think of this as a highlight through the whole book. So we're going to start today with chapter 8, and so last time we were going over chapter 7. And one of the things that keep coming in the book of Daniel is the repeated mention of visions and also the kingdoms that are coming up. And today we're going to contrast these two chapters. So the first question that we want to address is why Daniel 8 exists. And so before we get into the study, one of the things that becomes very apparent these last few days is that as we look at the history, I believe that for the most of us, we can look at the prophecies and we can look at the things that are happening here in the U.S., some of the developments that are happening across the world. And I think that it's a time when you feel that the time of the end is near. You feel that Christ's second coming is near. Before, most of us would agree and we had faith that Jesus would come again. We know about the prophecies, but there comes a time when you begin to look at what's going on and you begin to actually feel it. This week, I got a call from a friend, and so when I was up in the DC area, if you remember, at one point we went with some of the church members to give some of the great controversies in January 6th. And so we were sharing with a lot of people, and we got to meet a couple of the individuals that make some very important decisions in the U.S. And so a lot of them are interns, and so they're working on different policies with different senators. And so we had the opportunity to give one of the great controversies to one of these individuals. And so we kept in touch, we exchanged cards, and not too long ago, he sends me a text. And so he had actually read the great controversy when I gave it to him. He likes to read a lot. So he read it and he says, you know what, everything that is mentioned here in the book, I can see that happening in the very near future. And so we left it at that. And so we had different types of conversation, but just in the last 2 weeks, he sent a message, and it was very different than the previous one. The previous one was, I read it, it makes sense. We look at U.S. policy where we see that this could possibly go in that direction. But this time, he texted me, he's like, man, I saw one of the things that is going to be happening very soon, and I actually see that it's going to happen. And so we began to talk about it, and we got into specifically what we see here in the book of Daniel, specifically in Daniel chapter 8. So when we go to verse 1, it says, in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at first. So if you remember from chapter 7, in what year of the reign of Belshazzar did Daniel have the vision in chapter 7? Who remembers? Daniel chapter 7, when he recorded this, we go back to chapter 7. It says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. And so chapter 7 takes place 3 years before this vision actually comes to him. And one of the things that we realize when you compare these two chapters is that Daniel 7 reveals who rules history. So you're going to have different kingdoms, and that's very apparent. But when we come to Daniel chapter 8, it also speaks about the kingdoms, but with a little twist. In Daniel chapter 8, it reveals what evil does to the truth. And so we'll get to that toward the end. So when we go to verse 13, this is one of the questions that I would like us to think about as we go through this study. In verse 13, we have this question asked. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint, which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice? How long, and this is the question that we want to address, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice? And we'll see eventually why this question becomes very, very important. And so when we come further in the chapter, we're going to go toward the beginning. And so now we're going to take a look at the vision that Daniel actually has. And so the very first vision that he has, it tells us here that he's actually sitting in the palace. And it says, And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan, in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai. And so I want you to place yourself in the shoes of Daniel. Daniel is here in this palace. And one of the things that is very clear to Daniel is that he has seen in vision before what's going to happen to the kingdoms. And at this point, Daniel is still living within the kingdom of Babylon. He's still living in that time period. And so he's sitting here in the palace. You can imagine that Daniel is one of those guys that he lives and he breathes politics. And if there is something that Daniel understands very clearly, is what politics is. And so he's sitting here in the palace, and once again, he goes into vision. And it says here, Then I lifted up mine eyes, and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram, which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. And then in verse 4, it says, I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. And then later on in verse 20, God is very clear, and he tells him exactly what this actually means. In verse 20, it says, The ram which thou sawest, having 2 horns, are the kings of Media and Persia. And so up to this point, Daniel is not distressed. Daniel is not getting sick, as we will see toward the end of the chapter. Daniel is fairly calm. And remember, he's living in the time of Babylon, and he knows through the visions that he has received that soon, at some point, the Medes and the Persians are going to take over the kingdom of Babylon. So none of this is actually surprising Daniel. Not yet. And so we keep going, and so he gets the very next part of the vision is the goat. And this is where things begin to get surprising for Daniel. In verse 5, it says, And I saw, considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground, and the goat had notable horns between his eyes. And then something else happens to this goat. It says, And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. So I don't know how many of you have actually gone to a farm, but what's the difference between the size of a ram and the size of a goat? Who would like to take a guess? The ram is pretty big. The goats, if you look at some videos on YouTube on how goats actually behave, goats tend to be very mischievous. If you're not looking, he's gonna come from behind you and actually push you. And so here's Daniel looking at this vision, and for some reason, this doesn't actually make sense, because as you know, rams are actually pretty big, and the goats are very, very small. And so it says here that this goat goes ahead, goes after the ram, and then in verse 7 it says, And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with shoulder against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns. So again, everything that Daniel is seeing here is out of the ordinary. Normally a goat would not do this to a ram, because a ram, just in its size, it's illogical. And then when we go again to verse 21, the angel explains the vision. It says, And the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. And then when we go back to Daniel 8, verse 8, it tells us what happened to this goat. It says, therefore the he-goat waxed very great. So he takes over the ram, destroys the ram. And then it says that this goat waxed very great. And when he was strong, something different begins to happen here. It says the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. And so if you remember from the previous visions, you had the leopard, and the leopard had the 4 heads. And so, just as the previous visions, it mentions these 4 horns that come up. And of course, these 2 horns represented the 4 generals that were going to replace Alexander the Great. And so then comes into the picture something very special. And this, I believe, is perhaps the highlight of chapter 8. When we go to verse 9, it tells us that out of these 4 horns, it says, and out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, and it says toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And so this horn begins to conquer even more places. What additional places do you see here that this horn is actually conquering? The previous one expanded just as this one, but this one begins to go to a different place. And it says here that it goes toward the pleasant land. And so this one is referring to the Roman government. Edward Gibbon writes, the Roman army soon appeared in Syria and Judea, and the whole country became subject to their dominion. So the Roman government began to expand. And then in verse 10, it says that this little horn, it says, and it waxed great. And now here's the twist. Even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. And so if you notice, up to this point, all the other kingdoms had conquered the previous kingdoms. They actually expanded. But this little horn, this little kingdom, was very different. Not only did it conquer the previous kingdom, but it also went and conquered the pleasant land. And not only that, but this kingdom had the audacity to do something very different, something that the other kingdoms had not done. And what was that? It says that it waxed very great, even unto the host of heaven. And then in verse 11 it says, yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. And so Uriah Smith, speaking about this little horn, he says this little horn must be understood to symbolize Rome and its entire history, including its 2 phases, pagan and papal. And so when we go to verse 12, it says, and the host was given him against the daily sacrifice by the reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and it prospered. Ellen White, in the great controversy, speaking about this power, this little horn, she says, for this the only authority claimed is that of the church. Here the papal power openly sets itself above God. And so, unlike the other kingdoms, this one is meddling with God. So now let's go to verse 11, and we're going to focus on what's happening here. So it tells us that he magnifies himself unto the prince of the host. It says, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. And so right off the bat, if you put yourself in the shoes of Daniel, the minute that Daniel hears, the daily sacrifice, what do you think is actually coming to Daniel's mind at this point? What do you think could perhaps be going through Daniel's mind? Or through any Jewish person for that matter? As soon as he hears daily sacrifice, the first thing that would be coming to his mind would be the sanctuary. And so in early writings, page 74, it says, then I saw in relation to the daily that the word sacrifice was applied by man's wisdom and does not belong to the test. And also Uriah Smith, speaking about this term here, it says the idea of sacrifice is not attached to the word at all, nor is there any word in the text which signifies sacrifice. So a more proper translation would be the daily. And again, going back to verse 12, it says, and it cast down the truth in the ground, and it practiced and it prospered. And so the question is, well, what does this power actually do? And so we're going to look through a couple of terms here. And the first one is, and we've spoken about this term before, and the first one is tamid. And so in Hebrew, tamid simply means continual ministry. All right, continual ministry. When the verse talks about that the truth, that it was going to be taken away, it doesn't mean that it was going to cease to exist, but it simply meant that it was going to be displaced, not necessarily destroyed, but it was going to be displaced. And then when we go to the other phrase there in the same verse, where it talks about that the truth was going to be cast down, it simply meant that it was going to be displaced. Now, the great controversy, speaking about this, it says the intercession of Christ in man's behalf in the sanctuary above is as essential to the plan of salvation as was his death upon the cross. So now let us go to verse 13. And it says, "Then I heard one saint speaking, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice?" And so this is the question that we were going to address more specifically in chapter 9. And so the question is, how long will this take place? So going on to verse 14, this question is actually answered. And so it says, "And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed." And so what's interesting here is that this question of how long, Daniel is not the one that's asking this question. The one that's asking this question is whom? It doesn't say, but it says a saint, but it's not Daniel that is asking this question. In great controversy, it says, "In the typical service, the high priest, having made the atonement for Israel, came forth and blessed the congregation. So Christ, at the close of his work, as a mediator, will appear to bless his waiting people with eternal life." Now, when we go to the very end of the chapter, this is where it is recorded on how Daniel was actually feeling. It says here, "And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward, I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it." So at the end, why do you think that Daniel all of a sudden was feeling very sick? He was very sad. It says here that he was kind of fainting. Why do you think this was actually happening? Again, talking about the kingdoms, this was nothing new to Daniel. Daniel was actually very aware what was going to happen. He knew that after the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians were going to come. They knew that after the Medo-Persians, the Greeks were going to come, and after that, the Romans. He knew all of that, but there was something that was making Daniel very anxious. Something was going on. And in verse 26, it says, "And the vision of the evening and the morning, which was told, is true." And here it explains, it says, "Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days." And so up to this point, Daniel is not understanding, but there was something that I believe that Daniel understood. I think to the very least, Daniel understood that this vision had something to do with the sanctuary. And if you look at Hebrew culture, there is this rabbi, and one of the things that he explains is that when you talk to a Jewish person, somebody that is very devoted, when you talk to them about the sanctuary, what makes them even sadder is not the part of history where they lost the sanctuary, but what makes a Jewish person even more depressed is that the sanctuary was being misused. And that's one thing that this rabbi kept repeating. It's sad that they don't have a temple, but he says it's even sadder for us when a temple is being misused. And so we can imagine that, when Daniel is seeing this vision, he doesn't understand what's going on, but one of the things that he understands is that truth is being cast out and something about the sanctuary is not right. In great controversy, it says, "At the time appointed for the judgment, the close of the 2,300 days, in 1844 began the work of investigation and the blotting out of sins." And so what exactly is this cleansing? And so when we go to Leviticus 16:29-30, it tells us exactly what this cleansing actually meant. It says, "Now this shall be a statute forever for you, in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, to make atonement for the children of Israel, for all their sins once a year." And so every single year, at the end of the year, they would come, and so they would prepare for this special moment when they had to make sure that all their sins had been forgiven, and they would get together. And one of the things that the Jewish people up to this point still do, which I think is very significant, a lot of people within the Jewish community, when you have Atonement Day coming up, they will not only write a list of some of the sins that they've committed throughout the year, but one of the things that I found interesting is that they also try to amend any type of broken relationships that happened throughout the year. And so this is kind of like the way that they prepare. And so Leviticus tells us that this happened once a year. And I also want us to contrast that with Daniel chapter 7. You remember Daniel chapter 7, you have the whole beasts, you have the whole visions, but also in Daniel chapter 7, you have this theme of judgment. In verse 9 through 10, it says, "And I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated, the court was seated, and the books were opened." Ellen White says, "As the books of record are opened in the judgment, the lives of all who have believed on Jesus come in review before God." She also tells us that the judgment is now passing in the sanctuary above. So now let's look at what did the angel mean when he said, "Understand." So in verse 17, the angel tells Daniel, "Understand, Son of Man, that the vision refers to the time of the end." And when we go to Revelation 14:12, it tells us, "Here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus." And so as opposed to the little horn, which disregards, the commandments of God, which disregards truth, God wants a people that will keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. So what happens if, in light that this judgment is going on, what happens if we feel that we're not ready? 1 John 2:1, it says, "If anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous." And so when we talk about judgment, this all of a sudden becomes good news for us. In Great Controversy, it says, "All who have truly repented of sin and by faith claim the blood of Christ as their atoning sacrifice have had pardon entered against their names in the books of heaven." And so when we go ahead and read once again Daniel 8:17, God is not telling us here that we need to be fearful of what's going to happen soon in the end time or before his coming. God also doesn't leave us to kind of speculate as to what's going to happen in the end time. The only thing that the angel tells Daniel here is very simple. The angel is telling him, "Understand, Son of Man, the vision refers to the end of time." And so one of the things that becomes very apparent is that when we look through prophecy, God wants us to have clear understanding on what's going to happen. Nothing has to be done with fear. Everything has to do with understanding. And so when we understand, we can finally have peace. That even though the future might look a little shaky, at the end of the day, the promise is, at the end of every vision, is that the kingdom of Christ will finally come. And all the evil and the suffering that we see in the world will be no more. And this was the promise that kept Daniel through this period in Babylon. And so next month, we're going to go to Daniel chapter 9. And so in Daniel chapter 9, we're actually going to get into the math of the 2,300 days in more detail. All right.